This module in our series is going to explain the difference between all of the different element types you can utilize when creating the visual interface of your own Bubble application. And so elements are the things that your users will see and interact with throughout your application. So these can be things like text, images, buttons, or even maps. The list just goes on and on. On the default index page that Bubble provides for you within any application you create, if you were to hover over any of the items on the page, these are all individual elements. If you're to double click on the element itself, it will open up what's called the element inspector. So this is where you can customize the settings of the element itself. And so if we were to look over to the left-hand side of our application, all of the elements are broken into different categories. And these start off with what's called your visual elements. And so visual elements are pretty self-explanatory. These are the elements on your page that will visually bring it to life. So these are things like text, buttons, icons, images, or even videos or maps. And so if I was to click on the value of our text within our element inspector here, you'll see that I'll have the ability to insert dynamic data. And this just allows me to replace this static text with any values stored within my database. So let's say I wanted to display the name of the current person who's logged into our application. I could start by typing the word hello, and then I would like to insert their name. So I could click on this option here to insert dynamic data, and then I'll need to choose a data source for this text. And because my user is a data type in my database, and I have a data field stored within that registers a user's name, I can select from the current user here, and I can choose to display their name. And now whenever someone logs into our application, it's going to say the words hello followed by their name. If you would like, instead of even displaying things like the current user's name, you can perform a search through your database for literally anything you have. The same thing will also apply to image elements. And so if I was to add an image element onto my page here, it's currently just sitting over the top of my text. But you'll see I have the option to upload a static image, which will permanently remain the same for anyone viewing this particular page. Or I could insert dynamic data and display a dynamic image. If you ever find that you need a particular element that Bubble does not provide, you can always choose to install plugins, which will allow you to add additional visual elements to your application. I've installed a plugin here that allows me to add charts onto my page. So if I was to jump into my design tab here, I now have the ability to add line and bar charts onto my page. So I can choose to add a chart element wherever I would like. I'm just going to move on to the next category of elements you'll find within Bubble. And this category is referred to as your container elements. So container elements are used to store a myriad of elements within them. And then it gives you the ability to control their position or their functionality from a higher level. Any visual elements that sit within that will match its behavior. There are a whole series of different container elements that will allow you to expand the functionality of your application. And these include elements like repeating groups and pop-ups. I do just want to touch base on the repeating group element right now, just because this is probably one of the most important elements within Bubble itself. So if I was to add a repeating group onto our page, what you'll see is that it looks just like a list of cells. And the purpose of a repeating group is that it just acts like a series of group elements stacked on top of each other. The key difference to a repeating group though is that it allows you to display a list of things stored within your database. But essentially all you need to do with a repeating group is design the visual elements in the first cell, and then Bubble will automatically pull the remaining data from your database and display it across the remaining cells. And if you'd always like to display more than 4 entries you have within your database, you can update the settings here. So you can just give it an infinite number of rows. So that way, if there's 1,000 posts within your Instagram application, a user could just continually scroll down and view all of those 1,000 posts. And so that's why you can start to see why repeating groups are such an essential element within Bubble. Because whenever you're building an application in this day and age, what you'll find is that most apps do require a list of things to be pulled from the database. So if you ever want to display things like a list of posts, or even a list of users, or a list of things like properties you have stored within your database, a repeating group element is exactly what you'll need to bring that functionality to life. One of the last things I just wanted to cover within our elements section of our tutorial today is just the next category of elements, which is referred to as your input forms. And again, as the name suggests, these are relatively straightforward to understand. Inputs essentially just allow you to give users the ability to input information, which you can then store in your database. So things like their email, their first name, their last name, and a password. And so in order to allow the user to store that information, I'm going to need to add a series of input fields on my page, which will allow them to type in those fields. So if I was to just preview my application here, what you'll see is that in the top left-hand corner here, I have the ability to type in this particular field. But when it comes to working with input fields, there's a few things I'd just like to highlight. The first is that within your element inspector, as always, you'll have the ability to customize the settings of this input field. And when you're working with an input field, you'll see there's a couple of different options in terms of how you can customize it. The first is that you'll have the ability to add what's called placeholder text within your input. So this is the text that just displays in the input until someone types within it. So if I wanted to prompt someone to add in their email address into this field, I could update the placeholder text to display the word email. And now if I was to preview my page once again, you'll see that the word email is displayed until I click within this field. And when I start typing, it's going to replace that text. The next field you'll see though is what's referred to as initial content. And so initial content is similar to placeholder text, only this value will be permanently stored within this input field. And the last few things that I just want to point out when it comes to working with input fields is this field that refers to the input content format. And this is quite important to understand when you're working with a number of different data field types. So let's say because we're storing the value of a user's email address, for this particular input field here, I'm going to need to update the content format to be structured as an email address. So that way Bubble knows that this needs to be a valid email address in order for it to process the value stored within it. And you'll also find that there's a number of different content formats for things like addresses, percentages, currencies, and even dates. So it's always important to make sure that the value of your input field matches the same value as the data field that you'd like this to link to in your database. And the very last thing I just want to cover about working with particular input fields is just the ability to update the name of them. And so within your element inspector here, you'll see that this element has a name associated with it. And at this point, it's just referred to as input email because it's pulling whatever name I've added into my placeholder text into the name of this element. But let's say if I'd like to customize the name of this, so that way when I'm building out a workflow, I know exactly which element to refer to. What you can do is actually just click on this field here. You can remove the text and you can choose to update it to whatever you would like. So now I'm just going to make sure this is called input email. And then when I create a workflow later on, if I wanted to store the value of a user's email, I just know that I need to refer to the input email field on my page. And that's everything you'll need to know about working with inputs within your element inspector.